In the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, each step Jalen Dawson took echoed like the beat of a heart pounding fiercely. At the age of 19, he stood there by the defendant's table, surrounded by scrutinizing eyes and murmurs. Everyone in the room believed he was just another naive young man, merely a criminal like any other, especially Judge Thomas Walker, who looked at him as though he was nothing more than a kid who knew nothing about the law. "This is not a debate club, kid," Judge Walker said, his voice dry with mockery. Soft chuckles rippled from the prosecutors and the audience. But Jalen, standing tall and looking straight at the judge, showed no sign of hesitation. He simply smiled gently, as if he held a secret that only he knew. And one thing was certain: this would not be an ordinary trial. They had made a mistake in judging him, and now Jalen was going to make them realize it. Not just a defendant accused of a crime, but a young man full of talent who had prepared his whole life for this very moment. The door to the courtroom slammed shut, and the atmosphere inside grew heavier than ever before. The footsteps of the jury and lawyers echoed loudly on the wooden floor. Everyone was expecting a quick, easy trial, just like countless other cases they had witnessed before. But no one expected that this case would not be so simple. It would not only be a lesson in law, but also a lesson in the mistaken assumptions, biases, and injustices that can exist within the legal system. Jalen Dawson, a 19-year-old young man, stood silently beside the defendant's table. He appeared to be completely at ease, his demeanor so calm that no one could guess his thoughts. His eyes shone brightly, as if he could see through everything around him. Despite being accused of grand theft, Jalen maintained an extraordinary calm. Like him, no one in this room knew that what was about to happen would completely change the course of events. Judge Thomas Walker's sharp gaze fixed on Jalen, his eyes clearly showing disdain. With many years of experience in the profession, he had seen countless young people like Jalen, those who had made mistakes and become trapped in the wheels of the justice system without a way out. He believed this was just another routine trial, like the thousands of cases he had handled before. "You're defending yourself?" Judge Walker asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "You surely don't think you can act as your own lawyer, do you?" A faint laugh echoed from the prosecutors, showing they were not surprised by Jalen's decision. A few people in the gallery couldn't hide their disdain. Curious eyes shifted from Jalen to the judge, then to the next defense attorney. Was this young man really trying to defend himself? Or was this just the beginning of an inevitable failure? Nevertheless, Jalen showed no signs of nervousness. He didn't laugh, nor did he appear flustered. In fact, he didn't even glance at the prosecutor or the jury. All he did was stand tall, facing the judge, his eyes full of confidence. It was a look that seemed to say to everyone in the room, "I can do this." And at this moment, no one knew that behind the nonchalant exterior of a 19-year-old, Jalen had spent many years studying law. He didn't need to tell anyone that he was an expert in the field. All he needed to do was stand there, listen to every word in the courtroom, and then he would show everyone his evidence and arguments. Jalen wasn't a novice. He was someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He had studied cases, listened to his mother, a legal professional for over 20 years, tell stories about the injustices in the courtroom, the tactics used by prosecutors, and how judges sometimes relied solely on assumptions. And now, he would have to face that very reality. The trial began, but what no one in the room knew was that this would be a different trial. Not just because Jalen was the defendant, but because he was the one who would bring about a change in how we perceive justice. Prosecutor Samuel Hart stood up from the prosecution table, walking confidently toward the front with an air of authority. He had many years of experience in the field, and for him, each case was like a puzzle that had already been solved. With his tailored suit, perfectly knotted tie, and a complete file in hand, Samuel began presenting his case before the court with an unmistakable, confident attitude. "Your Honor," Hart began, his voice steady and strong, as though he had been preparing for this moment for a long time, "we will prove that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, is the perpetrator of the theft of the Audi A6, a high-value vehicle that was stolen in the downtown area. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the car's steering wheel, and this is clear and irrefutable evidence." A whisper spread through the courtroom. People began to look toward Jalen, their gazes shifting from curiosity to suspicion. Some in the gallery couldn't hide their surprise, wondering if this young man could possibly rebut such a serious accusation. They thought the case was clear-cut, and that it would only take a short amount of time to bring the proceedings to a close. But what the prosecutor didn't know was that Jalen was not just an ordinary defendant. He was not like the criminals Hart had faced before. Jalen possessed an unusual calm, and more importantly, he had spent many years studying the law. He was not someone ignorant of the legal system. On the contrary, he understood better than anyone how cases like this could be manipulated. "Next," Hart continued, his confidence unwavering, "we have the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who witnessed the defendant driving the stolen vehicle before it was chased down. The officer apprehended the defendant when he attempted to flee. The reason the defendant ran is simple, because he knew he had committed the crime." Hart turned toward Judge Walker and the jury, his sharp gaze never leaving his target. "We have all the evidence to prove that Jalen Dawson is the criminal," Hart confidently continued, reinforcing his certainty. "You will see that the defendant's presence at the scene, the events witnessed by the officer, and the undeniable fingerprints are irrefutable evidence." Everyone in the courtroom seemed to agree with this argument, all believing that this was a straightforward case, one that would easily result in a conviction. The prosecutors and the jury seemed sure that the case had already been settled. But not Jalen. He stood there, his eyes fixed on the prosecutor and the judge, with a calm demeanor, as if he had prepared for a long battle, not a quick and easy one. Jalen didn't rush to rebut immediately. He simply stood there, continuing to listen to every word the prosecutor said, yet his eyes never left Prosecutor Hart, as if trying to anticipate his next move. He didn't appear flustered. On the contrary, he felt like he was standing in a game he had been preparing for years. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to have forgotten one thing. Jalen was not a naive or inexperienced young man. He was someone who had spent many years studying legal cases, even before he was brought to this courtroom. Jalen knew that victory didn't only come from clever arguments, but also from the ability to identify the holes in the case. As Prosecutor Hart finished his presentation, the atmosphere in the courtroom became tense. Everyone in the gallery sat in silence, listening carefully to each word Hart spoke. For them, the case seemed clear, the evidence seemingly irrefutable. However, in that moment, Jalen slowly stood up, his gaze cold and fearless. His footsteps echoed steadily on the wooden floor, each step light yet firm, as if he had practiced it thousands of times in his mind. Every eye in the room shifted toward him, and all attention was now focused on Jalen. Now, the tension in the room was palpable, the jury watching every move Jalen made, as though they were expecting a weak defense or a clumsy explanation. But instead of showing signs of panic or rushing, Jalen remained surprisingly composed. He didn't need to raise his voice or argue loudly. All he needed to do was say what needed to be said. "Mr. Hart," Jalen began, his voice calm but sharp, "you just said that I drove the stolen Audi and that Officer Ruiz saw me driving it. But I have one question. Was Officer Ruiz actually at the scene when the incident occurred?" That question struck like an arrow into the heart of Prosecutor Hart's mind. The courtroom fell into silence, and all eyes shifted toward the prosecutor. Hart paused, not answering immediately, and a flicker of uncertainty appeared in his eyes. He hadn't expected Jalen to ask such a simple but sharp question. Hart had been confident that he had the case in his grasp, but now doubts began to creep into his thoughts. Of course, his report clearly states that he saw the defendant driving the car, Hart replied, but his voice was no longer as strong as it had been before. Jalen didn't rush. He remained calm and continued with his question, each word coming out clearly and sharply. Then I would like to request the court to check Officer Ruiz's GPS records from that night. If he was actually at the scene, the data will prove that. But I think he wasn't there. The atmosphere in the courtroom immediately shifted. Prosecutor Hart hadn't anticipated that such a question could expose a flaw in the case he had believed to be airtight. His gaze began to dull, a hint of unease clearly visible on his face. The confidence he had exuded earlier began to fade, replaced by anxiety. He felt as though everything was unraveling. Prosecutor Hart felt like he was caught in a game he could no longer control. Jalen stood there, unmoving, as if he didn't need to rush to win. He simply waited, because he knew that each question he asked would reveal the mistakes in the case. It was not just a battle of wits with the prosecutor. Jalen was also taking on a legal system that had perhaps rushed to conclusions without thoroughly checking every detail. The jury and the lawyers could feel the change in the atmosphere. The courtroom became more tense than ever before, as everyone in the room began to realize that what they thought was the truth might not be the truth at all. Jalen was not just questioning his own innocence. He was doing something more important. He was exposing the contradictions in the very charges that the prosecutor had presented. Judge Walker ordered the GPS data of Officer Ruiz to be checked, a request that Prosecutor Hart could not refute. The entire courtroom fell silent, an absolute stillness enveloping the room, with only the ticking of the clock, as if time itself had frozen in this tense moment. The jury, the prosecutor, and all those present in the gallery could feel the tension in the air. All eyes were on the technicians, who were processing the data that would decide much of the trial's outcome. Several minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Every second seemed to stretch longer as everyone awaited the final result. Then a technician stood up and announced the result of the GPS check. The GPS data shows that Officer Daniel Ruiz was not at the scene at the time the incident occurred. When that announcement was made, everyone in the courtroom was shocked. Prosecutor Hart couldn't believe his eyes. His most important piece of evidence, the testimony of an experienced police officer, was now rendered worthless. This not only undermined the entire case, but also cast a huge doubt on the authenticity of the entire investigation process. Hart stared at the screen, almost as if hoping the data would change. But no, the truth had been revealed. Judge Walker didn't say anything immediately. He simply focused his gaze on Jalen, his eyes now full of doubt. Throughout the trial, he had seen many cases overturned by small details, but he never imagined that a seemingly insignificant detail could dismantle the prosecutor's entire argument. Judge Walker stared at Jalen, who stood there showing no signs of joy or triumph, but only silently smiling slightly. Jalen didn't need to do anything more. He knew that the truth had spoken. "Data doesn't lie," he said softly, his voice warm yet firm. "If Officer Ruiz was there would be GPS evidence to prove it, but there's nothing." Jalen's words echoed through the courtroom, causing the atmosphere to grow even more suffocating. The courtroom seemed to have become completely still. Those present couldn't help but feel the sharp change in the air. A few members of the jury began whispering to each other, exchanging glances, as if they too were reconsidering everything they had heard. Surely something was wrong. They had started to doubt the authenticity of the evidence that Prosecutor Hart had presented. Prosecutor Hart stood in silence, gripping his case file tightly, his eyes cast down at the table. He struggled to regain the confidence he had lost. But it was clear that the collapse had already begun. Everything had changed, and in that moment, all the prosecutor could do was stand there, unable to resist. While Prosecutor Hart tried to calm himself, the jury continued to look at Jalen, who now was not just a defendant, but someone who had shaken the faith in the legal system. Every word, every question he asked was not only gradually breaking down the case, but also raising doubts about how evidence could be overlooked or even manipulated. Jalen didn't need to prove his innocence with grand speeches. He only needed to reveal the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. And now, no one could deny that the truth had been exposed. Justice, in this moment, seemed to have been overturned, but could be restored from the very weaknesses the system itself had created. Jalen did not stop. He continued to exploit the weaknesses in the case, diving deep into the details that the prosecutor and police had either overlooked or intentionally ignored. He not only wanted to prove his innocence, but also to show everyone that justice could not be based on flimsy evidence and mistaken assumptions. "Now, about my fingerprints," Jalen said, his voice calm, yet carrying an undeniable strength. "Are you sure that just because I touched that car, I've become a car thief?" That question seemed to echo in the courtroom like a warning. Prosecutor Hart began to feel that something was wrong. He hadn't prepared for such a strong counterattack. Some of the jurors started frowning, while others exchanged confused glances. Questions began to form in their minds. Can touching a car really become evidence of theft? Jalen didn't give Prosecutor Hart any time to recover. He continued, not allowing anyone to interrupt. "You could find my fingerprints on a coat in a store that I never stole, and I wouldn't be a thief. So why am I being charged because of my fingerprints on a car I didn't steal?" Jalen's questions were like a storm, sweeping away the fragile arguments that Prosecutor Hart had built. The questions, seemingly simple, forced everyone to reconsider the nature of the evidence they were using to convict him. This wasn't just a theoretical blow. It was a real punch, exposing the flaws in the way this case had been constructed. Prosecutor Hart was flustered, unsure how to respond. Jalen's words were like sharp knives, tearing apart each piece of his argument, exposing the weaknesses in the charges. Hart felt as though he were trapped in his own words, unable to justify the mistakes he had overlooked during the investigation. The small details, which seemed insignificant, now became sharp weapons in Jalen's hands. The story of the stolen car was no longer just a simple story, but had turned into a lesson about listening, examining, and doubting what we take as truth. Every detail, every testimony could be re-examined, and in this case, Jalen had done that brilliantly. All eyes in the courtroom were fixed on Prosecutor Hart. The trust in him was no longer there. The questions Jalen raised not only made Hart flustered, but also made everyone in the room ask themselves, had they rushed to conclusions when they believed Jalen was the criminal based solely on a fingerprint? The air in the courtroom grew thick. People were no longer just listening to the prosecutor's accusations. They were looking at a bigger picture, one that Jalen had painted with his intelligence and patience. He was not just a defendant, but a person who was teaching everyone in the room a lesson about justice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of tense moments, Judge Walker, who had witnessed the entire battle of wits between the prosecutor and the defendant, looked at the jury. His gaze no longer held the mockery it had earlier, but instead, there was seriousness and contemplation. He had listened to all the arguments, all the evidence, and in the end, upon realizing that this case had been torn apart from within, he could not avoid making an important decision. "This case is dismissed," Judge Walker said, his voice firm yet acknowledging. "The defendant is free to go." Everyone in the courtroom fell silent, an overwhelming stillness enveloping the space. Any small sound seemed to be swallowed by the tension. as if no one could believe what had just happened. People exchanged glances, some unable to hide their surprise, while others felt a sense of relief. The jury said nothing, silently looking toward Jalen, who had proven that justice does not only come from clear evidence but also from honesty and thorough preparation. Jalen stood there, not showing any signs of celebration or pride. He didn't need to display joy or smugness, because this victory was not his alone. He knew that this win was not just a personal outcome, but a reminder of fairness in the legal system, a system sometimes clouded by mistaken assumptions, bias, and the rush to conclusions. Jalen's gaze never left Judge Walker as he continued to look at him.
For the first time throughout the trial, the judge's gaze was no longer filled with mockery, no longer with disdain. Instead, he looked at Jalen with a respect he hadn't shown before. "You should consider law school," Judge Walker said, his tone no longer mocking or derisive, but with a hint of admiration. It was the realization that Jalen was not just an intelligent defendant, but someone with the potential to become an outstanding lawyer.
Jalen simply smiled, responding with a confident look, as if he had known this moment would come. He didn't need to consider anything, because he already knew what he would do next. His heart didn't just win in this trial. It was a statement that he would go further along the path he had chosen. He would not just be a winner in a case, but someone who would change the system. A lawyer who could help others find justice, not just based on superficial evidence, but with insight and perseverance in uncovering the truth. As Jalen walked out of the courtroom, he felt no need to seek approval or recognition from anyone. He knew that the path ahead of him would be one he chose for himself, a path leading to greater things. The people out there might look at him and think it was just luck. But for Jalen, this was just the beginning. A beginning he had prepared for a long time. When the trial ended and everyone began to leave, Jalen stood there silently. His gaze was not directed at anyone, nor was he immersed in celebration or the feeling of victory. He had won, but not because he had proven his innocence. It was because he had made the entire legal system take a long, hard look at itself. A legal system that had too often overlooked false assumptions, judgments based on what people see on the outside, rather than the real truth. Judge Thomas Walker, who had spent his whole life in the profession, had to finally acknowledge that. His gaze at Jalen was no longer filled with disdain, but with respect, as if he had seen something he hadn't expected. "You should consider law school," he said, his words now full of genuine admiration, no longer mocking. Jalen simply smiled lightly. He didn't need to consider anything. He knew his path, a path that didn't just stop at being a defendant, but at becoming a lawyer who could change the lives of others. And in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. His future was not confined to this one trial. One day, he would be the one standing on the other side of the courtroom, beside those in need of the fairness that this legal system had once failed to provide. But today, this trial wasn't about Jalen Dawson. It was about the system. It was about all those who had been overlooked, those for whom justice had never truly arrived. What had Jalen done? He had asked just one question. Is everything really as it seems? And that question, simple yet powerful, made everyone think again. If this story has made you reflect on what happened in this courtroom, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to stay updated on future stories. Because as Jalen proved, sometimes one simple question can change the world.